Next from Chicago, our contributing correspondent Jeff Berkowitz sits down with Steve Edwards, the Deputy Director of Programming for the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Mr. Edwards, a former host of Chicago's NPR member station, discusses the role of the Institute, his memories of interviewing Barack Obama as a fledgling politician, and what makes for a good interview with a politician. This runs about 30 minutes.
You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name and politics is our game, and we will be doing lots of politics and lots of public policy this evening because we're talking about Steve Edwards is our guest. As I mentioned in the tease, he had been at WBEZ for 14 years or so.
Yeah.
Everybody would know 848, a really fantastic program. It's changed since, but when Steve was there, it was great. He did political interviews, he did current events, he did pop culture stuff. Now, for the last year and a half, he's been at the Institute of Politics, which is, the director is David Axelrod, who, of course, some would say he created Barack Obama. That might be going too far, but he certainly got involved with Barack a while back, and certainly when he was running for the U.S. Senate and then running for president. And so David Axelrod knows so much about politics and public policy, and now he's come back as a University of Chicago alum to give the university what it didn't have when he was there, which was some practical politics. And Steve Edwards is going to tell us, what's the essence of the Institute of Politics, Steve Edwards?
Well, first of all, I should say, Jeff, it's a thrill and an honor to be with you here because as somebody who's seen you work and watched you work, not only here, but around town over the years, and had you as a guest on some of the programs I hosted, I have great admiration for you and your commitment to politics.
Don't suck up to the host. Don't suck up to the host.
Okay, all right. But I do sincerely
no, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it.
The Institute of Politics, a nonpartisan institute dedicated to elevating the quality of public discourse around politics and public policy and to inspiring and training the next generation of public service leaders. That's the short statement, the mission statement that guides what we do. And we launched in January of 2013 formally, and we do 3 significant programs: a speaker series, which provides opportunities for not only students but members of the public, as you know, to get...
Who did you have in the speakers for the last week?
I mean, the last week with the holidays and so forth, it was broken up. But
let me
go back 2 weeks ago.
Two weeks ago, right.
Doris Kearns Goodwin on her new book, Bully Pulpit, looking at TR and William Howard Taft. We also had Richard Reeves on JFK. We had, before that, Joe Scarborough from MSNBC. We had Mark Halperin and John Heilman, the guys from Game Change on their 2012 book.
It's just like a who's who, who's in the news, who's important, who's written something of interest, who's involved in politics.
Last week we had Joe Biden, the vice president, come through as well. Yeah.
You could have had Obama over, and you could have called me, and just me and Barack would sit down. Because
just for a little chat.
Well, as a slight digression, you knew Barack way back when, right?
I did.
When did you first meet Barack?
I first met Barack Obama when he was a candidate for the 1st District congressional seat in 2000.
2000.
And in fact, here's something, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but myself and my colleague Gretchen Helfrich at WBEZ at the time, we were the co-moderators of one of the only debates, I think perhaps even the only broadcast debate in that campaign. It took place at Kenwood High School in the auditorium. Donnie Trotter was there, Barack Obama was there, Bobby Rush was a no-show for part of it and came midway through, stayed for about 5 minutes, and then left. And that's when I first encountered Senator Barack Obama.
And so did you know at that point, that would have been, so that was, the election was in March of 2000, I think, right? The primary,
yes.
Democratic primary.
Yes.
And so this forum was probably in January or February of 2000 or
That'd be about right, yeah.
And there was a fourth candidate. I'm blanking who it was, but I think there was a fourth candidate.
I only remember those 3, but you could be right.
But in any case, okay, so you saw Barack then. Did you say, I think that guy's going to be president of the United States? Did you really?
No.
Well, what did you think?
But I will say this, and I think, those who knew Barack Obama then, whether they were in politics or not, other journalists, had a sense that this was somebody who was a star or potential star within the political universe. I mean, it's a little bit like the NFL, right? You've got 22 people on the field. All of them have to be accomplished to get there. But on any given field, there's just a handful of superstars, and they have a certain kind of transcendent quality in their ability to connect with people, their ability to communicate, their knowledge of policy. And I think very early on, there was a sense that I had and that others who knew him in various circles that this guy had a special set of talents that, if you match them with the right opportunity, could go very far. I don't think any of us thought that he'd be president of the United States within a decade. No question.
But you probably thought.
But you thought this guy has a future.
He's got
and there
a
are a
big
lot of people writing. I mean, I remember there's a long article in the Chicago Reader, a cover story, one of those 40,000-word pieces that went deep into the race and his background. There was a sense, I think, in the press corps that, and some in that community that, wouldn't the first district voters be so lucky to have somebody like Barack Obama? There was an equally, I think, strong and ultimately much larger voice of people who felt like this was a guy who didn't understand the concerns of the average voter in that district, and ultimately that's why he got trounced by Bobby Rush.
Yeah, even Barack said he got spanked. It was like 2 to 1. Was it like 60,
yeah, it wasn't
60
close.
to 30 or something like that?
Yeah.
Maybe even worse.
Yeah.
And why do you think he got spanked by Bobby Rush?
Well, I mean, I think it had to do with some of the things I was just talking about in particular. Well, they had to do with, number one, Barack Obama was seen as somebody who was a Hyde Park resident, which is only one small part of that district, and not seen as the kind of heart of what first district politics are all about. I mean, you got to remember that district, as it was drawn then, also had significant swaths of Robert Taylor homes and Stateway Gardens. He was seen as somebody who was intellectual and elite and not part of the world of community concerns despite his community organizing. He wasn't somebody who grew up in Chicago. Bobby Rush had long-standing history in Chicago in that community as an organizer, as an activist, Black Panther Party member. And I also think he had an organization that he was able to tap to put him over the top. I also think that, frankly, Donnie Trotter and Barack Obama split some of that anti-Rush vote. That might otherwise have gone to one of them.
So Barack told me in 2002, when I asked him if he was running for the Senate, he wouldn't say then, but he may have said this off the record. He said there were mistakes he had made when he first ran for Congress, which he'd never make again, he said. And he said one was, he didn't have enough money to really run the campaign right. And maybe he was saying, he took pledges. He didn't really have the money in the bank. Next time he'd know he'd really have the money, okay? The second thing he said was, he started late. It's like the limousine liberals, talked him into this. This is a good thing. Once you run, you win, And it was too late. So he started running. I had him on in June of 2002. He wasn't really running then. He's actually made that statement, first thing we have to do is get Rod Blagojevich elected, which got me on the Bill O'Reilly show. But it didn't help him much because, right after Barack, when he was president-elect, on December 8th,
yes,
about 3 weeks after Barack is president-elect,
2008.
Rod Blagojevich gets arrested in 2008. And so O'Reilly says, hey, I hear you have some footage that Obama is a supporter of Rod Blagojevich.
Is that what happened? He called
And I was on there for 5 minutes. But he was perfectly fair, and I explained to them, like anybody would say that then. In June of 2002, who knew the guy was going to be selling a Senate
the entire
seat?
Democratic establishment largely was behind Rod Blagojevich.
He just got me on there because they wanted some cheap footage, that's all. He took a cheap shot and I
and you
swatted
gave
away.
it to him.
Well, I gave him the footage, but then I explained to them that anybody would do this, and O'Reilly agreed. And then he said he's an accommodator. Some people say that's great. Some people say it isn't. What do you say? And I said, how do you get to be president unless you do some accommodation, right? And for that, I never got to be on the show again. No, seriously. No, we went over. O'Reilly agreed with me. He was the fairest guy I've ever been interviewed by, except for Steve Edwards. Anyway, enough of that.
Well, thank you.
Back to the
I
Institute.
haven't been compared favorably to Bill O'Reilly in too many
You
contexts.
two guys are like peas in the pod. You should go on there. You want to go on? I'll get you on next week.
I'm good.
You want to have
I'm
Bill,
with you.
You want to have Bill come out there and spend a little time?
He'd be great.
He would be at the Institute of Politics. So tell people, you were telling him about, the first thing is you have these great speakers that come out there.
Yeah.
And then you have these fellows.
Right.
Bill O'Reilly could be a fellow. Tell people about what are fellows.
And I think he was a fellow at one point at Harvard, which is one of the models for the Institute at the University of Chicago.
It's Harvard Kennedy School. It's like a fair to me. There's Institute of Politics way up here, and then there's the Kennedy School down here.
Thank you.
Okay. So tell them about the fellows.
They'll call for that tape, by the way. So the Fellows Program is a 10-week engagement in the fall, a 10-week engagement in the spring. And we bring accomplished practitioners, be they elected officials, diplomats, journalists, NGO leaders, et cetera, policymakers, to come and spend 10 weeks at the University of Chicago. They teach a weekly discussion seminar. They also hold office hours to engage with students. And they are really given the opportunity to take advantage of the university's resources as well, whether it's research, whether it's auditing classes, whether it's working on a project, to really try and both connect what they're doing to the campus community and also hopefully draw from the campus community to some degree what a great faculty member is doing in terms of leading research on a public policy area. Be able to take that back to where they come from. The idea being that in both cases, each entity is better off for having had that kind of exposure and that experience. Great ideas from the academy, great ideas from practice, challenges between.
And these are, look, they're all free, all of these programs.
Yes.
The speaker programs, which may have 200 people coming, as Steve said, it could be Joe Scarborough, could be the folks who wrote Double Down, it could be Richard Reeves, all free. The seminars are usually at lunch with the fellows. Some of them are at 4:30.
Most are at 4:30, some at
Some
lunch.
are at lunch.
Yeah.
But they're sort of designed so the students, mostly undergrads, can attend. So if they have classes, there are no classes at lunch, presumably not too many classes that start at 4:30. Right. So this is not for credit. These are what these folks do. And we're just showing you the graphics of the people at the senior management. Keep that graphic up. For the Institute of Politics, there's David Axelrod as the director, and Darren Reesberg, who's the executive director, and Steve Edwards, deputy director of programming, and Jan Costner, deputy director of events and marketing. I think Jan is also the communications. I had a card. She's got like 4 hats, I think, right? So she's
communications is under her umbrella, yeah.
Along with events and marketing.
Right.
So there are many others. You probably got 13. If you
It's
go to their
about 10,
website,
yeah.
you can go to UChicago. What do we go? It's
politics.uchicago.edu.
And we'll get that up, politics.uchicago.edu. So I didn't even know. I'd met some of these people and seen them around, and there are about 13 or so staff. So you have, you've got a big operation there that's been going on for about a year and a half now, right?
Yeah, and we did 40 public events this quarter alone. The University of Chicago is on a quota system. We've been averaging about that in our first 3 quarters. We do about 40 fellow seminars per quarter. And then the third piece are opportunities for students to get hands-on exposure to politics and practice, principally through internships. We sent about 165 students on summer internships, everywhere from Rubio's office to the White House to places in between, local government,
so
NGOs.
You process these interns. These interns don't come in here and stay at the Institute of Politics. Some may, right?
Right. We do have some interns at the Institute of
But
Politics.
the great majority is to
focus
process some to get them out.
Yes, learning, to be doing substantive work where they have a chance to not only contribute but also gain experience that they can use to further their own.
And how long are the internships?
The internships are 10 weeks in the summertime, and then we have a few academic internships as well in aldermanic offices and a new program that will provide research opportunities for UChicago graduate and undergraduate students in local units of government here in the Chicago area principally.
So you say, are they principally local as opposed to in Washington or Springfield?
The academic year internships are principally local just by virtue of the fact that these are students who have to go to school. Summer, we did about a third in DC, another third in Chicago, and then the other third was split elsewhere around the country.
And the ones that are the year-long internships, the local ones, did you say?
That's right. Yeah.
And how many hours a week do they devote to
Well,
the
it
internship?
varies depending on the student's schedule.
But they're full-time students.
They're full-time students, so this is anywhere between, on average, 10 to 15 hours of work, sometimes as much as 20.
So when I go, and you do, folks, they let, how do we describe this? Middle-aged folks, they let adults, they let alums, everybody, it's free.
You pass security.
I pass. So I'm going to this seminar, and there are about 20 kids there.
Yeah.
I call them kids. They're young adults.
Yeah.
They're probably 19 to 22. And then there are a few alums. I'm not the only one, but maybe 2 or 3.
A few members of the community,
and then members of the community, and it's just fantastic. Number one. Milton Friedman said there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. He's wrong. Milton, we apologize. May he rest in peace. But if there is a free lunch, it's over at the Institute of Politics.
We do
you
provide
often have
Sandy
free,
for you.
fantastic lunches.
Thank you.
But seriously, the main thing is the program. Access to this program is free, and I can ask a question or two of these folks, but mainly just to listen to the flow of the conversation. This is like a high-level seminar
Yeah.
It's the University of Chicago.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you and I both having experience in the media, I've been struck by how different, in some respects, the contextual frame is around these encounters. You know, somebody comes on your show, somebody comes on Hardball or The Factor or even shows on BEZ, there's an expectation on the part of parties, and I think now increasing on the part of the audience, that this is going to be an interview that's all about making news, about accountability, about pinning people down on particular issue positions in politics. And that's an important function. And there are many people who do that very, very well, and it's necessary in our politics. But I think what often is missing from the public discourse is sometimes a sense of understanding, and you do this well on the show, understanding what somebody's motivation is for the views that they have. So how are they thinking through a problem? What are they doing to actually try and advance something? What are the possible outcomes that they might see? And when they come to the Institute, there's, I think, without that sort of media context, there's sort of an opportunity to have a freer discussion. I don't know that people are telling tales out of school. It's not like people are revealing things that they wouldn't otherwise reveal.
They're all nominally off the record.
But you hear them thinking aloud.
Yeah.
You hear them sort of trying to process and deal with problems, trying to actually figure things out.
You mean the fellows as well as the students?
Yes, and I also think many of the elected officials and other players in politics, you get a deeper sense as to why they pursued the career they did, why they actually came to hold the views they do, all those kinds of things. And I think that's, when done well, remarkably illuminating and rare, frankly, in our current discourse.
So some of the fellows, give us the names of some of the fellows. You had somebody,
Amy Walters,
who appeared on the show from the Political
Ramesh
Report.
Panuru of National Journal. We have Vin Weber, former Republican congressman. In addition to them, we have former Missouri Secretary of State Robin Carnahan.
So you think you're achieving balance between Democrats and Republicans?
We are working very, very hard at that. It's
you don't
very,
count
very
like
important.
every number, but you try to see conservatives, liberals, Democrats,
Yes.
Republicans,
I mean, every
giving
way you
people
can,
a spread.
across
Now,
the ideological
because
spectrum.
somebody might suspect, David Axelrod, he's been known maybe to be a little left of center, right?
Yes,
Would that be fair?
He does have that reputation.
But he's out there striving and telling you guys to be balanced, right?
Yes.
He's
and
not
that's
taking
something
advantage
that,
of this.
I'm not surprised by that because my conversations with David about this leading up to this, indicated to me that he was admitted to that. But I've been continually impressed that everybody at the Institute, everybody at the university is intent on making this a place where Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives across the spectrum can come and engage and feel like they have a home. So we worked really hard at that.
So what do you think? We're going to go back and forth here. Probably got about 15 minutes left, maybe a little less. Because this show, it's about you, it's about David, it's about the Institute of Politics. You made a career move, going out of mainstream journalism. In a sense, what you're doing is somewhat similar now. You're interviewing some of these speakers.
Occasionally, yeah.
Occasionally. Not before, you were doing it every day, so it's a little less. But what's your view? What makes a good interview? You just alluded to that. So if you were doing an interview at BEZ and you had a politician there and you had Barack Obama there and it was like 2003 and he's running for the U.S. Senate, bam, what are you trying to do in that interview with Barack Obama?
I think in some cases an interview like that is slightly different from other interviews that he might do. I think
we'll come back to that, but so you're doing that back at BEZ. 2003, he's running for the U.S. Senate. He's got 6 competitors in the Democratic primary. What are you trying to accomplish in that interview?
I'm trying to do a couple of things. Number one, at just the most basic level, I'm trying actually to give the potential voters who are listening an opportunity to understand what he stands for on a series of important issues, how he might vote on a series of important issues, and trying to move that broadly and with some degree of depth in each area. So number one, who is this guy and how might he represent your interests as an elected official representing the state of Illinois, number one. Number two, I want to actually get a sense for how what he says checks against what he's actually done or said in the past. Because, as we know, politicians oftentimes, massage the record or they shape what they might say for the particular audience they're talking to. So if somebody has sort of evolved their position, changed their position, not acknowledged a particular point of view, I want to make sure that's available to the voters and that we have an opportunity to pursue that as well. I also want to make sure that we have a sense as to who they are what are the kinds of things that have motivated them and shaped them in some way. I often think that while it's vitally important to understand where people are on the issues. Increasingly, as I've covered politics, I also come to believe that character does count. And what I mean by character is not just this idea that you have particular values that you stand for and as a social issue set. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean, how do you think, what's important to you, what kind of a person are you, and how might you make decisions? Those things are very, very important.
So when you had Obama there, if
Yeah.
you can remember back to 2003,
Yeah,
what kind
it's
of
a long
things were
road.
you trying to get at as to his character?
Well, I think at that point, I was trying to get a sense for how he would translate who he was as a state senator representing the district on the south side of Chicago, largely based around Hyde Park and Kenwood, to an experience that was statewide. So how that connects with the concerns of voters in Carbondale, the concerns of voters in Rockford and Moline, concerns of voters in DuPage County. Because as you know, to run and win and be successful in the city of Chicago, especially in his district, is a very different set of concerns and focus points and what you might actually do to win voters and win over voters and maintain their support than what you might do if you're running for that same seat in Carbondale.
When I asked Barack, what's different about him relative to his competitors, I was kind of struck by his answer. This was back in 2003, 2004. He said he's running against for the U.S. Senate nomination in the Democratic primary. He had 6 competitors.
Yeah.
And he said, number one, he knows the issues, he takes a position, and he speaks out. And Steve, I would have thought almost any politician would do that. And yet he was right. That distinguished him. He knew the issues. He took a position and he spoke out.
Well, and I think David.
Do you agree?
I would agree with that. And
most politicians really don't do this.
Well,
I don't know if we should tell the students they should all go into mathematics or something.
Well, I also think that this is something that President Obama would say now, I'm sure, and David has said on a number of occasions, that probably the best example of that quality in him, and it's not uniquely his, of course, was his opposition to the Iraq War early on, which was unpopular and potentially problematic for him at the time he took it, if he was thinking about a statewide office, given what public opinion showed for the Iraq War at that time. But he went down to Daley Plaza, made that statement, called it a dumb war. I remember moderating a debate with the Democratic candidates where that came up. We had 20 minutes on roundtable on foreign policy with everybody, and people were really taking him on that particular issue. But he stood by it, and I think that was an example of him sort of stepping out in front on an issue that was probably difficult for him to sell to some voters in the state at that time.
Do you agree
now
that
not?
His decision to take that position in October, when he stood out at the Federal Plaza and made that fiery speech, as you said, he said, look, I'm not a pacifist, and he said it a lot more fiery than I'm saying now.
Yeah.
He says, but I'm not against all wars, just dumb wars. Okay? And it was yelled out, okay. And then he came on this show a month later, sat in that chair, but it
Was it really just that span of time?
November 25th, 1 month later, because he made that speech in October. I hadn't seen that. I actually didn't know his answer. I knew less about politics and followed it less then. So I said, not knowing, I said, well, Barack, how would you vote if you had been in Congress at that time? Because they had already voted, even though this is 4 months before the invasion, to give Bush what some Democrats would say, a blank check. And Hillary voted for that, Hillary Clinton. John Edwards voted for it, John Kerry. All these other Democrats at the time who were sort of viewed, as later as anti-war, they voted for it. Barack in October makes that fiery speech, and he says, well, Jeff, and then he moderates it, gives a much quieter tone. He says, well, Jeff, if it came to me that way, as a yes or no vote, I was thinking to myself, well, what the hell, Barack? How else is it going to come to you? But he did that, okay? He's late. If it came to me, as a yes or no, aye or nay, I think I would have voted the same way as our senior senator. I think I would have voted the same way. But he did say he would have done it. Yeah. It was just and I always wondered, is it more moderate because he's on this show and it's not giving a speech? Yeah. Or he thought about that, maybe he ought to tone it down a little bit. But the point is, if he hadn't taken that position at that time, and they wanted that clip. I mean, they used it, and it's
Yeah,
all
they
over
did.
the internet. You can
I
find
don't wanna
it.
suggest
Google
that this was-
Berkowitz and
this
Obama.
was,
you know.
you could call this sort of, an act of political courage. You could also call this an act of political calculation and strategy and differentiating yourself from a very crowded Democratic field, and what's going to be authentic to you, what's going to resonate, what's going to differentiate yourself. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest they saw an opening there too.
And I don't think he would have become president, because when he's running in the primary, and it's just down to Edwards and it's down to Clinton, it's down to him, both those folks voted for it. And as you know, in the Democratic primary, the base is
It was an
more
enormously
liberal.
powerful
Right. He said,
position for
he questioned
him.
judgment. I had the judgment to oppose it. When the two supported it, he wouldn't have been president of the United States. He
4
wouldn't
years
have won the
later, it was
Democratic
an
primary.
enormously
Right?
powerful
Yeah.
point of differentiation.
All right. So,
And underscored this idea of change, and I'm not a part of the establishment.
so now you're doing an interview. Who were you interviewing last week? You had at the speakers program.
I
Or the
interviewed
week
Mark
twos.
Halperin and John
Right.
Heilman with Double Down.
Double down. So tell people who they are and what were you trying to do in that interview? How did that differ from interviewing candidate Barack Obama?
That's a great question. Mark Halperin is a former political director for ABC News, now writes for Time. John Heilman writes for New York Magazine. Those two were the two authors behind Game Change.
Let's see if we can get this up
There you-
here.
look at this. Look, God, you're good.
God, okay.
Wow.
So here we go, right here. So double down.
So Game
Mark
Cha-
and John, you owe me big time. No, I'm just kidding.
So,
Okay,
so this is the follow-up to their
double down.
2008
Game Change,
campaign
right,
book,
right.
Game Change, which of course was turned into the HBO movie. Inside the Obama and McCain campaigns, lots was made of that, and particularly the Palin pick on the part of McCain. This is their 2012 take. For me on this, number one, is anytime you're doing a book interview, and this clocked in at more than 400 pages, is trying to sort of make sense.
Because you actually had read the book. Larry
did.
King said, I don't read the book, I want to be like my viewers. Seriously, that's what he
Yeah,
said.
I know, I
The guy
know.
made $10 million, $30, $100 million. How much do you make? He didn't read the book. You read the book, right?
I read the book.
Okay.
I understand his philosophy about that. I tend to believe that
You should read the book if you're going to interview somebody.
yes,
Yes,
and
okay.
I do think that. So this gets to the point I was.
But I
gonna
interrupted
make.
you. Go make the
Well,
point.
the point
What
I
are you
was gonna
trying
make
to do in
relates
this
to
interview?
this.
Yeah.
So you've got a 450-page book. What about it is interesting, salient? How do you actually encapsulate
Right.
the book to some degree without taking us knee
So you're
deep
doing
on-
a half-hour interview and then you're turning it over to questions to the audience.
And then also, how do you create, this is also, I think, part of hosting a program, whether it's live in front of an audience or live in front of a broadcast audience like this. Part of what your job is to invite more people to the table, metaphorically. And in this case, it's your audience. People who haven't read the book, don't know the topic, don't know who the two individuals are, and only 3 or 4 people in the book in that audience. So I was also trying to create a framework. And the third thing I was trying to do is not repeat every single interview that had been done with them up to date, up to that point, and not just sort of regurgitate, now a full year's worth of postmortems on the 2012 campaign. So what were the things that were interesting and thematic about their take that might help us understand what was really going on in the 2012 campaign and its lessons?
Okay, so we only have, time's gone all too fast. You've got to commit to come back because we only got about a minute left.
All right.
And we've barely touched the surface here. And send your guy, Mr. Axelrod, over here. Could you do that for me, please? Maybe he can, follow up and pick the few things you've missed and follow up. Okay, so in a minute, what do people need to know about the Institute of Politics? What did we not cover that you want to make sure they understand?
Well, I think we've talked about a lot of the structural things,
Right.
but
Give us the passion.
What we are
Do people sense the passion of your fellows, of your speakers?
yeah, frankly, the University of Chicago has been a part of significant change and significant advancement throughout its history. We feel that the problems that politics sort of exhibit now can best be addressed by something that is vibrant, something that is truly passionate about substance, about elevating the quality of discourse, about motivating young people, not to just knee-jerk take jobs in any other sector, but to think about.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.